This is, of course, the first of our built environment pedagogy conversation in the PATIO conversation series. And we have today's session being run by Priya Jain and Catherine Desai, who are the director and coordinator of the theme respectively. And I'll just hand over to Priya then to take it from here.
Sounds great. Welcome, everyone. Just some housekeeping rules. We'll have two presentations and followed by some comments by a respondent, who Catherine will introduce them all shortly. But if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat, or you can kind of ask them yourself once we open it up to the audience questions. So welcome to this first session, as Saptrishi said, on built environment pedagogy. This theme engages in a historical analysis of the discourse within and about education and methodology in architectural, engineering, and vocational institutions in the Indian Ocean Rim, which includes the trans-cultural exchange of personnel, ideas, and pedagogic models. And I'll give it over to Catherine to introduce our first speaker.
Thanks, Priya. So we're delighted to welcome our first speaker, Dr. Shaikhah Ali Alsalhi. She's an assistant professor of architecture at Kuwait University. She received her master's and PhD in architecture from the University of Pennsylvania. Shaikhah's research examines the relationship between architecture and other fields of knowledge, art, and science during the early modernization of architecture in the Arab Middle East. Her work explores the transfer of architectural knowledge and technique between the West and the Arab region, considering the impact of nationalism, colonialism, and Orientalism. Shaikhah's talks titled Shifting Boundaries, Architectural Knowledge and Modernity in 19th Century Cairo. Thanks very much, Shaikhah. I'll hand over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Priya and Catherine, for the introduction, and thank you for arranging this talk. I'll share my screen. Everything's good?
Looks good.
Thank you. So my research explores the boundaries of architectural knowledge in the Arab Middle East. I focus here in my presentation in the case of 19th century Cairo and examine its transition into a modern discipline. To unpack this, I will highlight two aspects. First, what do I mean by architectural knowledge, its changing boundaries in relation to modernity? And second, the transfer of knowledge and the decolonization of the history of modern architecture. So first, what do I mean by architectural knowledge? Architecture can be studied in various ways, including being a product, discipline, theory, or profession. But here, I examine the history of architecture as a field of knowledge, as an intellectual domain. Architectural knowledge has boundaries, and its boundaries evolve. They are not fixed and they're not rigid. These boundaries have continuously evolved, especially its relation to other fields, such as arts, science, and mathematics. Architecture is not a universal phenomena. It's not static, and its boundaries has been subject to change in response to many forces, such as place, power, resources, and technology. In pre-modern era, for example, architectural knowledge in the Arabic context, like many other regions, was closely associated with sciences and mathematics. Actually, architecture was linked to the science of geometry, ilm al-handasa, and embedded under mathematics and very close to the science of construction, ilm al-bina. So the division between arts and sciences is a modern phenomena, and the question of whether architecture is art or science is only a modern question. The rise of science and technology and the shift from craft to machine transformed the concept of architecture. Before industrialization, the practice of building was led by artisans and craft guilds. Architectural historian Siegfried Gittien stated that, quote, "A new architecture has its origin at the moment of transformation from hand to machine." End of quote. Gittien criticized the schism between architecture, art, and science. In Gideon's words, quote, "We can hardly answer the question, what belongs to architecture? Where does it begin? Where does it end? Fields overlap. The boundaries of individual fields blur. Where does science end? Where does art begin? What is applied technology? What belongs to pure knowledge? Fields permeate and fertilize each other as they overlap. So this is the first aspect I look at, is the question of architecture itself and its boundary, and becomes more challenging when I situate this within this Arab context. So the second aspect I look at is the transfer of knowledge and the colonization of the historiography of architecture. Architecture history is constructed as a Eurocentric narrative, meaning that only the West has an accepted narrative of progression from classical origins to its modern existence. This Orientalist perspective of architecture history is best exemplified in this famous diagram, Fletcher's diagrams of the tree of architecture, first published in 1896. The Eurocentric diagram divided world architecture into historical and non-historical styles, associating the living trunk with healthy branches to uninterrupted Western styles from ancient Greek to modern America, which we can see here. So from Greek to America. But other nations, like Egyptian, Mexican, or Indian, to dead ends, demonstrating a biased view of architectural development. So writing about the 19th and 20th century modern architecture in non-Western regions remain a challenging task entwined with the legacies of Orientalism, colonialism, and nationalism. The narrative of the evolution of Arab architecture is constructed in fragments, lost between its Islamic pre-modern traditions and national modern existence. The claim that modernity in the Arab region was only associated with its interaction with the West is a myth. Recent scholarship has been directed toward building autonomous narratives of the modernization of non-Western regions, confronting this Eurocentric reading of modernism and arguing against the center-periphery narrative. Notwithstanding the emergence of modern ideas, technologies, and form of governance in the Arab region is primarily associated with their transfer from the West, this study emphasizes that knowledge transfer between different regions is actually a phenomenon that existed in human history, arguing against the hierarchical perceptions of nations. It also rejects the colonial perspective that knowledge transfer is a one-directional process and that the East is only a passive receptor. I emphasize that knowledge acquisition is not merely a process of importation, and that in the Arabic context, modernity did not emerge from an intellectual void. The evolution of architecture and knowledge and its transition into a modern discipline is a complex process, and this research aims to debunk the clash between the civilized and uncivilized worlds. My study demonstrates that Arab architects, engineers, and intellectuals from the 19th and 20th centuries sought to root this modern knowledge to the Arabic context. So as part of my study, I tried to trace where I found the roots of those modern shifts in architectural boundaries and the transfer of knowledge. And 19th century Cairo demonstrates a very interesting case. I looked for the early moments of transformation and the shift from craft to machine, and craft guilds to modern schools, and the emergence of the first modern construction-related school, which is the Muhandis Khana. When we go to the early shifts, it becomes challenging to say architecture or engineering, or those terms are very loaded and they're modern terms. But as we go back, it's very challenging to point where is architecture and where is engineering. In the 19th century, Cairo went through a short-lived industrial revolution that transformed its entire social, cultural, and architectural fabrics, following European models. The shifts in architectural knowledge cannot be viewed in isolation from 19th century aspirations to establish modern industrial states. During this period, the existing educational system, including the Kitab, Madrasa, and Al-Azhar, did not provide the necessary knowledge to support the governor's aspiration for this industrial state, and the crafts guild, likewise, failed to be an effective source of training. This lack of local training encouraged the development of a national educational system following Western models. The first modern construction-related schools in the Arab region is the Muhandis Khana, founded in 1816 in the citadel in Cairo. This was the early shift in training from traditional institute to the modern education system. In my research, I look into this period from 1816 to 1879 and try to draw periods in which the first stage there weren't curriculums or actually subjects to study. It was an architect or an engineer and a group of students assigned to help him, and they work on this insight. So the students act like translators in terms of translating knowledge and translating language. The foreigner, whether French or English engineer, and the artisans graduating from the craft guilds. And the second stage, it's when Saint-Simonians traveled to Egypt and they had their aspiration to build the Suez Canal and transfer this modern scientific knowledge. And they developed the Muhandis Khana following the Polytechnic curriculum. And the third stage, where I argue architecture as a field of study was introduced, it's when the question of renovation and keeping existing structure was introduced. So Muhandis Khana as a time and place is a very interesting moment of transferring of this knowledge. A movement of ideas and technologies from Europe to Cairo was intensified through individuals, Europeans and Egyptians, moving through different networks. The lack of local expertise encouraged the governor to invite and hire expertise from the Ottoman Empire and Europe, and also send more than 300 students to Europe to acquire modern knowledge, which provides an interesting case to explore those channels of knowledge transfer. Throughout the 19th century, there was an evident Arab interest in acquiring Western modern science and technology. Several Arab intellectuals of this period advocated for the revival of rational sciences or al-ulum al-aqliya, and not to limit education to religious subjects, which was the norm of that period. However, this was seen as a revival rather than an importation of Western knowledge. The writing of the 19th century Lebanese scholar Boutros al-Bostani illustrates his acceptance of knowledge transfer between nations. Al-Bostani argued that Arab schools developed sciences when medieval Europe was in a state of ignorance, advocating for a modern revival of Arabic sciences. In his book, خطبة في أدب العرب, on the literature of Arabs, Al-Bostani stated, quote, "When science and culture, al-ulum al-adab, were in danger of being lost due to turmoil in the West, they found refuge in the schools of the Arab who preserved the middle link in the change of knowledge that connected old learning to the new. Without this link, there would be a huge void between the ancient and modern sciences. When Europe was impressed in medieval ignorance, it was the Arabs who opened their schools to the Europeans to awaken them from their indifference. And science reached the border of Europe under the protection of the Islamic crescent." This call to revive Arabic sciences is consistent with the views of 19th century Egyptian scholar Rifat al-Tahtawi. Being an Azhar graduate, Sheikh al-Tahtawi urged Egyptians to learn non-religious sciences, claiming that Muslim scholars pioneered this knowledge. He argued that modern sciences, which appeared to be produced by the West, had their origins in Arabic Islamic knowledge. In al-Tahtawi's words, quote, "These practical wisdom sciences that now appear to be foreign are Islamic sciences that foreigners have transferred into their languages from Arabic books." Interestingly, this same scholar, he highlighted the division between arts and sciences that was introduced to the Arabic context during this period of the 19th century. It has been argued that al-Tahtawi, who studied in France, wrote in his well-known manuscript, تخليص الإبريز في تلخيص باريس, The Extraction of Gold in Summarizing Paris, first published in 1832, he stated, quote, "The French have divided human knowledge into two categories, sciences, al-ulum, and arts, al-funun. Science is the empirically proven knowledge achieved by evidence, while art is the knowledge of making certain things in accordance with the specified rules." This Arab interest in acquiring modern science appeared also in the context of architecture and engineering. According to architectural historian Khalid Asfour, it was the French-educated Egyptian engineer Ali Mbarak who began the debate of what constitute an appropriate modern architecture in the Arabic context. Mubarak wrote in his Khatat in 1888, Today, people have abandoned old ways in construction in favor of European styles because of its more pleasant appearance, better standards, and lower costs. In the new systems, rooms are either square or rectangular in shape. In old system, living rooms, together with their dependencies, were disordered. Corridors and courtyards occupied a lot of space. Most of the spaces lacked fresh air and sunlight, which are the essential criteria for health. Thus, humidity accumulated in these spaces, causing disease. Facades never followed any geometric order, thus looked like those of symmetries. In the new system, facades are ordered and have a good familiar look. So I put in bold where Mubarak drew connection between architecture and geometry. Mubarak studied in France and also studied and taught at the Muhandis Khana. So his book were taught at the Muhandis Khana. And he wrote books on geometry and construction. Among his early publication after his return from France were manuscripts on geometry. In this research, I argue that Mubarak, in his 19th century books, reintroduced knowledge that had a presence in the pre-modern Arabic intellectual books, but was unfamiliar and/or unavailable to him at that time. This emphasized that Arabic sciences in the modern period did not emerge from an intellectual void. So as part of my research, I look into the pre-modern books in Arabic that looks at the geometry. And many of the knowledge available in this book appeared again in the 19th century Mubarak's book that he claims to be translating from France. So knowledge existed, but it was either unavailable to him or he didn't mention them. But it's highly possible that it was not available for him. And two of Mubarak's books illustrate a good example of this case. This is the first book, تقريب الهندسة, Handbook of Geometry, written in 1860. Mubarak described this book as, quote, I compiled a short book in which I gathered the fundamentals of arithmetic and geometry, which has helped many people. So this book is a text base, and its topics could be divided into 4 main sections: Introduction to Geometry, Measurements, Tools and Exercises for Land Surveying, and finally, Tools and Exercises for Drawings on Paper. This book had a purely pragmatic purpose to collect basic geometric concepts and techniques into a handy volume for officers. Mubarak's discussion of Euclidean geometric properties is comparable to an earlier Arabic manuscript from the 9th century, from the Abbasid period, from a manuscript titled مدخل إلى صناعة الهندسة, Introduction to the Art of Geometry, written by Qista ibn Luqa in around 1820. Qista ibn Luqa is translator and scholar of the Abbasid era. The second book, titled تذكرة المهندسين وتبصرة الراغبين, a reminder for engineers and informant for seekers, written around 1874. This book focuses on geometric construction, so it's a page from the book is on the left. The manuscript was designed as a reference book. It is a collection of articles published in 1870s. It was dedicated to students to provide them with the foundational knowledge in engineering. The articles are arranged in around 17 chapters with some supporting illustration. As a reference for workers, this book is comparable to the 10th century manuscript that I have a copy of on the right by Al-Bozjani, titled ما يحتاج إليه الصانع في علم الهندسة, about that which the artisan need in the knowledge of geometric construction. Although Mubarak's books on geometry and engineering raised discussions similar to those previously studied in Arab Islamic mathematicians, he did not acknowledge these sources. His primary Arabic Islamic references were only Egyptian historian Maqrizi of the 14th century and Al-Jabarti of the 19th century, but no mathematicians from earlier Islamic period. It is unlikely that Mubarak had access to these earlier manuscripts, as historian Al-Jabarti from the 19th century noted the scarcity of Arab Islamic manuscripts accessible at the beginning of the 19th century. So this could explain why Mubarak did not include writings on geometry from previous periods of Islamic history. In conclusion, modernity created a rupture in the evolution of knowledge. The separation of arts and science, the rapid advancement of technologies, and the transfer of knowledge and technology surely impacted the evolution of architectural discipline. By tracing knowledge that exists within intellectual domain, modern knowledge in the Arabic context did not emerge from an intellectual void. The writing of the 19th century scholar reintroduced knowledge that was already existed in the Arabic intellectual domain. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Shaikhah. Really looking forward to discussing your presentation. Our second speaker is Dr. Ali Javid. He's an architect, educator, and scholar in Sydney, Australia, specializing in the history and theory of architecture. He completed his PhD in architecture at the University of Western Australia in 2023. His research primarily focuses on architectural pedagogy and the history and theory of architecture in the Global South. Ali's talk is titled Architectural Pedagogy Between Two Iranian Revolutions. He'll be reviewing his recent book, The Politics of Architectural Pedagogy in Iran, From Pedagogical Revolution to Revolutionary Pedagogy, 1960 to 1990, which was published by Routledge in 2024. Thanks so much for joining us, Ali.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Could you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you so much for introduction. Also inviting me for this presentation. So let me to share my screen. Okay. Actually, in this presentation, I will give you a quick overview of the book, and for each chapter, I'll give you an example to better understand the main ideas and debate of each chapter. The main discussion of the book is about the interrelation between the architectural pedagogy and the politics. Accordingly, the book investigates the transformation of Iranian architectural pedagogy following national and international key socio-political changes, such as Cold War, the 1963 White Revolution, and the 1979 Islamic Revolution. For its analysis, the book selects two leading Iranian architecture faculties at Tehran University and the National University. The introduction draws the historical and theoretical framework of the book on the interrelation between the Iranian revolutions and architectural pedagogy. In this chapter, the book first describes the emergence of the term third world in the political competition between the US as the first world and the second world, the Soviet Union, during the Cold War. It shows how the slogans and rhetoric of each revolution, I mean the 1960 White Revolution and the 1979 Islamic Revolution, were influenced by these interventions. For example, look at the relationship with the West in two revolutions. In the White Revolution, the relation moved towards development and the progress with the West. But in the Islamic Revolution, the relationship changed to confrontations and resistance against the West. Or in the context of social class, the White Revolution targets the middle class to carry out the social and economic reforms from top to down. But the Islamic Revolution supports the poor classes and through the moves towards the political overthrow. Following, the chapter points to the crucial role of education during the Cold War and revolutions. It defines the architecture school as its cultural political entities involving a dynamic network of human and non-human actors, such as teachers, models, students, curriculum, drawings, journals, exhibition, and communities, whose architectural production are influenced by socio-political ideologies. The first chapter explores the interrelation between the role of education in the Cold War, the White Revolution and its pedagogical program, and the emergence of the National University. It then discussed the role of Italian cultural diplomacy in the transformation of curriculum and mood of pedagogy at the Faculty of Architecture at National University. The term third world was actually coined by the US President Harry S. Truman during the Cold War as a part of the modernism theory. To counter Soviet Union influence, the US provided financial and logistical support to third world countries through the program called the Point For Program. The main aim of this program was to implement modernization and development programs to transform traditional society into modern. The 1963 White Revolution in Iran was one of the socio-economic reforms implemented with support of this program. Education was a key factor in reaching out these goals. As a result, new universities with modern curriculums and educational programs were set up with the help of American consultants, not just in Iran, but also in many third world countries as well. Based on this frame, the National University, as you can see in this map, and its architecture faculty was established based on the US model, yet the architecture program and the course content, the course and curriculum were heavily influenced by Italian pedagogical system and thoughts. Here, the chapter mentions the role of cultural diplomacy and Iran-Italy cultural agreement, which led to increase the teacher-student exchange, funding program, architectural pedagogy transfer between Italian and Iranian architecture faculties. This chapter also highlights the key role of Iran-Italy Cultural Association and the ISBO, or Oriental Institution, in establishing the architectural practice and education exchange. The interesting point here, in this exchange, is the connection between archaeology, heritage, urban restoration, and architecture. Chapter 2 offers a detailed account of structure and curricular revision at Iranian architectural schools from 1960 to 1968. This chapter shows how they emphasize on three issues of the city and its development: housing a new type of residence, and preservation and restoration of historical contexts and monuments was in line with the implementation of the White Revolution pedagogical program. Chapter 3 points to the intellectual opponent discourse of Bestuxification and the return to oneself, and the impact of 1968 student protests on Iranian architectural pedagogy. The term of Bestuxification, coined by the Iranian intellectuals Ahmad Fardid and Jalal al-Ahmad to describe the fascination with and depends upon the West, to the detriment of the traditional, historical, and cultural ties to Islam and the Islamic world. The term was adopted to the return to oneself by Ali Shariati, the architect of the 1979 Islamic Revolution, to be an alternative against Iran's modernization program. The first part of the chapter dives into the role of Iranian students studying abroad, especially in the US and Italy, in shaping architecture education after the 1968 student protests. In this regard, this part tells the interesting and unique story about the School of Architecture at Howard University. The university was established to educate African Americans to confront racism and the challenge of white dominance in education and the practice. However, in the 1960s and the 1970s, it became a school for educating third world students as well, with the aim of breaking the hegemony of the Western culture and paying attention to the vernacular and local needs of third world countries. As an example, the main question in design studios was, what is the most appropriate forms for third world architecture to take? Iranian students such as Kamran Diba studied at this school, who upon returning to Iran became an important figure to transform both architectural practice and pedagogy. Following the chapter explores how the discourse of Bestuxification and return to oneself shape anti-Western and alternative pedagogical models by Marxist and Islamic teachers and students in Iranian architecture faculty. It highlights the focus on vernacular architectural pedagogy, especially in the poor and undeveloped areas. In this context, the chapter also explores how architectural exhibition and conferences play a key role in promoting the teaching approach that values tradition and cultural heritage over modernism and the rapid development. During the Cold War, this exhibition became an important space for cultural exchange between nations. In the late of 1960 and the early 1970s, Ismail, an Italian architect, held a series of architecture exhibition at Iranian architectural faculties. These events were great opportunity to share the expertise of Italian architects and urban planners, highlighting their strategy for tackling the challenges of urban development. Or the role of international conferences. The chapter shows how international conferences held in Isfahan and Shiraz influenced Iranian architectural pedagogy. Famous architects like Louis Kahn and Ludovico Quaroni play key roles in shaping a dialogue between tradition and modernity. In chapter 4, the book draws on Ali Mirsapai's idea about the Kuwait Revolution to explore the significant shift towards the Eastern Islamic perspectives and culture in pedagogy during the 5 years leading up to 1979 Islamic Revolution. It looks at how anti-imperialist ideas shared by Marxist and Islamic students, thinkers, and student associations challenged the previously dominant Western-focused approach in architectural pedagogy. In this regard, we can mention the discourse of ethnicity and continuity root in the discourse of return to oneself. They significantly influence in various urban reconstruction projects and architectural pedagogy in different traditional cities in Iran, such as Yazd, Isfahan, and Naim. This approach, supported by Italian architects like Ludovico Quaroni, played an important role in shaping alternative mode of pedagogies within Iranian architectural faculties. Chapter 5. Chapter 5 covers a short period between 1979 and 1980, when all revolutionary and political groups, including Marxist and Islamic groups, had the freedom to think about the role of architecture and pedagogy in the post-revolutionary society. They tried to redefine the role of architectural faculties and their pedagogies to serve a new society beyond the boundaries of architecture. The chapter demonstrates how the anti-modern pedagogical approach and interest in underdeveloped areas and poor communities served as a powerful tool to respond to the slogan of the 1979 Islamic Revolution. The final chapter narrates the purification policies of Islamic government during the Cultural Revolution from 1980 to 1983, and the subsequent years 1983 to 1990, leading to the strict Islamization of architectural pedagogy. In fact, the Cultural Revolution aimed to purge university from Western and Marxist influences and placing them firmly under the control of the Islamic forces. Following the chapter, how Cultural Revolution changed the curriculum, program, and mood of pedagogy at architecture faculties, and how the lack of coherent theoretical framework for defining Islamic architecture led to various interpretation and educational approach by Islamic educated in Iran. For example, a committee was formed to censor academic books and only issue permits for publication of books that were in line with the Islamic and anti-Western discourses. Or Islamic forces, by creating institutions and imposing new laws such as mandatory hijab or control relationship between a student, made the university environment completely different compared to the before the revolution. As you can see in this picture, for example, this is the first student trip after the Cultural Revolution, and this is the student trip before the Cultural Revolution. And finally, conclusion. To conclude, as it clear from this diagram, the 1963 White Revolution, with its development and modernization program, significantly expanded the network of actors in architectural pedagogy. This expansion was driven by Iranians' growth, political, economic, and cultural relationship with other countries, as well as by domestic reforms that led to emergence of new actors in architectural pedagogy. In contrast, the 1979 Islamic Revolution had the opposite effect, leading to the contraction of the network. The revolutionaries and Islamic Republic, due to the anti-development approach, opposition to the Western modernization, and anti-Western policies, imposed the restriction on the network of actors and relationship. As an example, the Cultural Revolution also purged the individual, including revolutionaries themselves, to create a unified, homogeneous, and controlled network in architectural pedagogy. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Ali.
So now we'd like to invite Dr. Mark Olweny to give the response to Shaikhah and Ali's presentations. So Dr. Olweny is currently a visiting associate professor in architecture at the Auburn University School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape Architecture. Mark holds professional degrees in architecture from the University of Adelaide and urban planning from the University of South Australia. Mark's PhD, undertaken at the Welsh School of Architecture, Cardiff University, explored the socialization processes in architectural education with particular focus on East Africa. Mark's research currently focuses on 20th century architecture and urbanism of sub-Saharan Africa, as well as decolonization in architectural education. Mark has practiced across the world, and some of his recent papers include necessary transgressions in architectural education in Uganda and the foreign and the local in architectural education in late colonial and post-independence East Africa. Thank you very much for joining us, Mark, and we're looking forward to you starting off the discussion on Ali and Shaikhah's fantastic presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and thanks for those two very wonderful presentations, which come from a similar context in terms of geography, but also quite diverse starting points, leading us to very similar outcomes at the end. So Shakira's presentation, looking at the context of Egypt and the link between nationalism, colonialism, and Orientalism, is quite interesting in how she was exploring the idea of how knowledge itself is transferred from one part of the world to another, in this case, how it emerges in the context of the initial elements of architecture education in the context of Egypt. Which for me was interesting because it reminded me in some regards to a book I read when I was doing my own studies in the context of Sudan, and it's a wonderful book by the name by Porter and Porter, which is a husband and wife team, and they were writing about their experiences in the context of Sudan and the beginnings of their formalization of architecture education. The book is called Everything is Possible, Our Sudan Years, and I had a bit of a chuckle when she mentioned that there was a challenge in Egypt in getting people to recognize what on earth this thing called architecture is, because that is exactly what was found when the Mushdin was being implemented or introduced to Sudan, and nobody actually had any idea what it was. Coming back to my own experience in Uganda, it's exactly the same thing, because the word architect doesn't exist in the traditional languages. It gets mistranslated. Essentially, the direct translation is drawer of plans. So you can see similarities right across the African continent there. So looking at some of the challenges that came with that, the idea that architecture knowledge itself can be questioned, the very fact that Sir Bannister's Fletcher had set in stone what a lot of schools believed architecture history should be and how it was presented, became very problematic when you moved from the center to the periphery, where the ideas of what constituted architecture beyond the center were no longer included. And this was something that was presented in different parts of the world. And it was only in the last 20, 30 years where that became questioned, although in some places of the world it still isn't being questioned. And the tradition still exists. And the paper, one of the papers that was mentioned, I do query that, because that idea of Sir Bannister Fletcher's approach to architecture history still persists, even in some schools in the context of Africa. So the myth of modernity and the myth of the Eurocentric approach or reading of history is still quite pervasive, despite it being questioned even in the context of Egypt more than 100 years ago. Then we have to come back to the idea of the colonial project itself, and how the idea of knowledge transfer was and still is always very part of that discussion, where the idea of knowledge always coming from the center to the periphery, rather than it being mutually agreed upon, something that has happened during the entire existence of humanity. Knowledge transfer has taken place, but more recently it has been presented as being from the center to the periphery, from the civilized to the uncivilized world, which is essentially the basis of the colonial project, and that's what justified the colonial project in the beginning anyway. So that was a key point that I found, which is quite important there. Brings forth the next point, which is related to the separation of knowledge and why it came about, and how that has an impact on architecture education, even to this day, related to this separation between science and the arts, And the book, The Two Cultures, is a key one of that, which again questions that. And again, this discussion between arts and science is one that is quite pervasive in architectural schools and architectural knowledge fields as well. One thing that came up, which intrigued me, was the publication of a number of books on architecture in the context of Egypt. Some of them translations, some of them are writings based on existing knowledge in the context of Egypt. But one thing, and it could be a starting question for Shaikhah, is the links between those publications and the treaties in architecture that are linked to such things as the classical orders and the Yangzhou Fasi from China. Is that China or Japan? No, that's Chinese. So how do those relate to that? And essentially one of the things we do study the classical orders, we tend not to study the other treaties from different parts of the world. But the goal essentially was the same, really, to transmit architectural knowledge in different forms to people who were not versed or educated directly in those different areas. So that's the first presentation. The second presentation on Iran, which is actually quite closer to my own research, looking at the way politics has an impact on architectural pedagogy, which for the most part we do take for granted, because once we're in the system, it's very difficult to look out. It's only in hindsight, many times, that the reality of what we're going through becomes evident. So in this case, looking at the White Revolution and the Islamic Revolution in the context of Iran and how that had an impact on the evolution and development of architectural pedagogy in that context. And in some way, they are parallels to the decolonization processes that have occurred in the context of sub-Saharan Africa. And we only have to look at the changes that happened to the architecture curriculum at the Kumasi Institute of Science and Technology in the 1960s, when it was realized, again, in a similar way, that the original curriculum, which was introduced from the United Kingdom, was completely inappropriate for the local context. So it was essentially rewritten. And again, looking at very similar things to what was going on in Iran, looking at the city, looking at housing, but in this case, not looking at restoration and preservation or conservation, but looking at development in this case, because the lack of built form in the context of sub-Saharan Africa as a consequence or an outcome of the colonial project. Then, of course, there are links to the race issues in the United States. Intriguing that Howard University became a center for some of this discussion, the debate, which can be linked to the Pan-African movement, certainly going beyond the standard idea of what race relations are, and now taking it essentially to a post-colonial, post-structural economy, and bringing in countries beyond the African continent, going beyond the idea of race, and now taking it to a wider sphere as well, which I found quite intriguing. At the heart of all of this seems to be a reaction to Western hegemony in terms of knowledge. And this is a thread that runs through both of these presentations, and how the responses in both cases, despite the time difference, the response to what emerged in some cases as, and these apply in different ways to both presentations, is epistemicide, epistic injustice, and cultural sterilization, how those have had an impact on the responses of these different locations to what was going on, and how that has created a different approach to architecture education as a result of that. And really the last thing that came from Ali's presentation was this idea of pedagogy being used to respond to the needs of politics, which in some of my readings can be seen to parallel what happened. And strangely, this actually paralleled what happened in East Africa around the same time, the 1960s, 1970s, with the collapse of the University of East Africa. And the reason for the collapse of the University of East Africa was differing or different political ideas that emerged from the three countries that were the basis of East Africa at the time. So Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. So Kenya and Uganda moved to the left, and so they moved to greater relations with countries of Eastern Europe, while Kenya wanted to retain its links to the West. And so that caused tensions within East African politics and eventually led to the collapse of the East African community in 1977. But East Africa, the University of East Africa collapsed first in 1970 as a result of this, because ideology became a key driver in what universities were and how the leaders wanted to take the university. So universities have had a long history of being used in this way. And it's intriguing to see that within the context of architecture education, this has a major impact in the way students themselves study, what they study, and how exactly they study, and the outcomes of that. So that's my quick take on the two papers. So I'll come back to the first question that was given to Shaikhah, which was where's that one? The links of what she found in the context of Egypt and the treaties that we're more familiar with, the classical orders, and then the one that comes from the East, the Yangzhou Fasi. Can you tell us your reading of that in the context of your own research?
Thank you, Mark, for the valuable comments. It's very interesting to see like their restructure, the main ideas I went through. I start with your first points on the term itself, because when you talk about treatises, you're talking about the books that were written in Egypt about architecture, yes? Mm-hmm. So the question I would start with is what architecture? Because there is this conception that it's challenging. So I start in the Western context. The conception that architecture is one of the oldest crafts, and Vitruvius's book is the first book on architecture. And engineering is the new discipline that emerged with industrialization. So this conception has been challenged, and the overlap between architecture and engineering in the Western context has been discussed. It becomes even more challenging in the Arabic context, because going back in historical treatises, the word architecture did not exist. I found that, so the translation of engineering is handasa, and handasa is the same term for geometry and for engineering. So if I go back in history, I found the practice of building and construction and in the books of geometry, which is in Arabic in books of handasa, which is geometry. So it becomes challenging to point where this is a book of engineering or this is a book of architecture or geometry. The term architecture first appeared in a book, Architecture as Imara, appeared in first 15th century, Ibn Khaldun, the introduction of Ibn Khaldun, but it was approached as civilization or urbanization, not as architecture. The first time it was used as architecture, it appeared in late 19th century. The book is not available, but in the title, the term architecture was used. The modern use of architecture or imara only appeared in the 20th century. So it becomes very challenging to trace, okay, this book is architecture or engineering.
Interesting. Okay. But I guess one of the key things with this is now we start seeing direct links between the use of the term architect and the colonial era, because that's where that distinction became quite clear. Well, even in many cases, it's still not clear, as we see in many countries around the world where it's not. But coming back to Ali, and then we can sort of explore this a little bit more. Then I'll pass it back to Catherine, and then we can open the questions up. I'm very intrigued about Howard University, because it's a link to the Middle East that I didn't know, and I don't think many people knew. How did that have an impact on the development of architect? I want you to expand on that because you just mentioned it in passing. How did that have an impact on the developments in architectural pedagogy in the context of Iran? And is it still present, or has that sort of been superseded by events?
Thank you so much, Mark, again, just for very great feedback and comments. So do you mean about the impact of which university? Sorry, just Howard?
Howard University in the United States.
Oh, yeah, exactly. So actually, you mentioned a very great talk about the revision of some curriculum in Africa. The interesting that I want to mention about Howard is that Howard, after the 1963 student protest, they asked students occupy the university and asked to change the name of university to Black University, actually. And then asked to kind of revise the curriculum based on the curriculum which meet the African culture. And after that, architecture school run some like the student exchange and also a student travel and a summer school in Africa. And the first one was in Kumasi, actually. This was a very interesting because, yeah, exactly, very interesting, case. So they followed this kind of exchange also summer schools in different also countries in Africa. Nigeria, like the Egypt, like very different actually countries. And the interesting about the third world is, because the third world students at that time increased at the Howard University because of the atmosphere and also the curriculum. They changed the curriculum to meet the third world student needs. For example, interesting is that the Howard University is the first university in the US, and actually, I mean, maybe in the first in the world, that put the Islamic architecture principle and design in the curriculum, even before the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Because after the Islamic Revolution, government put this unit in the curriculum. But at that time, the Howard University, because the interesting is that the Muslim community in Howard was very, 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 high, and also there are a lot of Muslim in Howard University. So because of this, they put the Islamic architecture principle and design in the curriculum. Or, for example, the unit of tropical architecture in underdeveloped area in the curriculum. And the interesting is that they changed they asked the educators, they hire educators from different third world countries. For example, they hired the educators from Iran, from Egypt, from Trinidad and Tobago, from Jamaica, from Venezuela, to make a kind of diverse environment for faculty, kind of invite, and also because the students came from different third world countries, and then it would be better to have a kind of educator from their home countries. And actually, Kamran Diba, as one of the example I mentioned, he studied there under the kind of teaching of some Iranian educators. At that time, Iranian educators defined the political theme for architecture in Iran. It means that they said that the Shah, the king of Iran, the Reza Pahlavi, he's aligned with the West culture or West hegemony. So architecture at that time in Iran should be very political. And then they try to train the architects, the architects who want to return to Iran, based on this theme. And actually, Kamran Diba, when he returned to Iran, he defined the architecture as a humanistic architecture. So architecture should respond to human needs, to tradition, to culture, to religion, to belief, not to the state or something that, like, for example, the Beaux-Arts system that kind of defined in a fine arts or University of Tehran previously. So still, Diba is one of the most important figures in contemporary architecture in Iran. And after that, I think interesting is that this culture continued by the other Iranian educated in Howard. For example, we have Khosrow Moradian. Khosrow Moradian actually, he didn't travel to Iran, but actually has a very political, pedagogy against the West hegemony in third world countries. For example, he traveled with the students to Tanzania, and he looked at the Tanzania against the housing problem and how the Tanzanians solved the housing problem. I forgot the name of the guy who was the prime minister in Tanzania after the independence. Just let me to remember, because it's a very important figure, and actually published a book based on this narration, how this prime minister became the independence from the West and the East, and then tried to solve the local problems, and how the architecture contribute to this, I mean, this kind of context. So still, I mean, the Howard University is one of the interesting case. There are many Iranian there, and actually for effect, contemporary effect, still the Kamran Diva is an important figure, and his practice, because he did a lot of project in Iran. I mean, for example, Shushtarno in the south of Iran, the museum in Tehran, and also other housing. And all of them try to kind of address the local needs, the local community needs, tradition, and the religion, actually.
Catherine, I think because we're out of time, I'll pass it back to you, then
Yeah.
we can open the questions to others.
Can I just have a question to Ali? When you talked about that architecture was intended to represent culture, was it that parallel to the regionalism movement at that period? Because it was this discussion and even in the Arab region. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
Okay, I think we can open it up for questions. We actually have a question in the chat. Saptarishi, do you want to say it out loud?
Yeah, thanks. So very interesting presentations both, and my questions directed to Shaikhah first, which is that I was just wondering, because what you displayed and what you showed us were, I mean, my reading of it was that there were these two opposing impulses in architectural education, right? One which is trying to reclaim the pre-colonial sort of knowledge framework, and then there is the other one, which is almost trying to displace the indigenous thing. So I found that quite fascinating, that this is all happening in a very short span of time in the 19th century. I was just wondering that, you know, there is, and this is coming from what I've read about the South Asian context at the same time, that there were these developments in education and pedagogy were often accompanied by legal instruments pertaining to things like copyright and like intellectual property as a whole. So because the separation of the arts and sciences occurred in the domains of things that were of utility, that were then governed by patent laws, and you know, and then there was objects of artistic value or produced by artists that were governed by copyright laws. So in a way, what had happened with a lot of English administrators, especially like Henry Cole and other people in the government art colleges, is that they were able to produce documentation such as the ones that you showed of geometric logic and frameworks to think about design, which was copyrighted. So the artisanal practice in a way got alienated from modern education. So I was just wondering, were there any kind of similar developments that occurred in especially the second half of the 19th century in the Egyptian context?
Honestly, I didn't look into that legalization aspect. And what I can just add to this is accessing archives of that period is very challenging in Egypt. I tried to go there, and it was not allowed for some security reasons. So I was looking for these. Even I had some, when I told you about a book that has the title of architecture, I was going back and forth to the archives there. It was not allowed. So I couldn't access this information. My main knowledge was from the available writings, mostly in non-Egyptian archives, mostly in Europe, English and France. So I hadn't access to this information.
So there is a sort of, I mean, what you're describing itself is quite telling, that there is almost like a barrier to being able to access the pre-modern or the pre-colonial knowledge frameworks in the Egyptian context itself, because of I mean, I think in the Indian context a lot of that occurs due to oral traditions, and there was, like, you know, the treatises are relatively rare, and it's complicated by the caste system and how certain communities or groups are the owners of knowledge that is not widely shared. So it's, yeah, I think, but anyway, thanks for that insight, because it does, even the absence of archival documents or the relative difficulty in accessing them is quite telling. Thanks.
I think we have, there's a note from Isaac. I don't know if it's a question or a comment, but I encourage folks to look through the chat because there's some interesting follow-up comments there as well. But if anybody has her hand raised, Uzma, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
I think Uzma Siddiqui has her hand raised.
Hello, thank you so much. I apologize. My voice is really bad because I'm recovering from a terrible cold. But thank you so much, Shaikhah and Ali, for your presentations. What interests and intrigues me is that both Iran and Egypt also have an architectural history that predates Islam. And I was very interested in just learning about what the, pre-Islamic pedagogy might have been. And also particularly in the case of Iran, even before the Shah and the westernization, you had developed an Islamic architectural discipline, which had its influences, including in India. The Mughal architecture is heavily influenced by Iranian architecture. And I think also in Egypt, there has been an evolution, and in general in the Islamic world, in terms of the interpretations of Islam. So, there's been a movement where there's been a very Wahhabi, sorry if I'm being a little bit too political, but a more Wahhabi interpretation, which has led to more austerity, which is reflected also in the architectural elements. So what I wanted to understand, and if you can please shed light on, is how do you think pedagogies have evolved with the different interpretations of Islam? Because I think post-Iranian Revolution, the interpretation of Islam was very different to, pre-revolution and pre-Shah. And I think also in Egypt, you've had more leaning towards the more, Saudi interpretation with the Muslim Brotherhood. So I'd just be interested in learning about that from both of you. Thank you.
Either one of you can go ahead.
Yeah, can I go? Yes, Shahia, first, please.
Sure. It's interesting when you mention about the pre-Islamic training, because when I looked into the craft guilds, there is this conception that pre-modern schools, there was just artisans, but actually craft guilds are very well structured. And when the artisans start training, there is a system of examinations. And this is started for Egyptians from the Pharaonic, pre-Islamic, and it continues. So the training and education and training for architects existed before, and it was very structured. I don't look into the Islamic question, but I look into the training of architecture and its knowledge. And yes, it's existed, and the system is very, very well developed. Ali, you have the Islamic question.
Yeah, actually. Yeah, thank you so much for the question. Actually, it's very interesting because I can say that both, the Pahlavi dynasty and also Islamic State, both of them use the history as a political tool, as a propaganda. For example, in a Shah, during the Shah and the Pahlavi dynasty, they used the pre-Islamic history to make a kind of propaganda, to make identity, to make a nation, because they define that our destiny is continue of the pre-Islamic history, and also they emphasize on the archaeology. As I said, the Ismail, they commissioned the Ismail to send the Ismail to the area that this can find some heritage or monument building or urban context based on the pre-Islamic. For example, the Persepolis or Pasargad, or for example, in the east of Iran. So they try to make a connection between the destiny of Pahlavi with the pre-Islamic history. And then we can also obviously these things reflect in the pedagogy, as for example, when at the time of the Beaux-Arts, mostly they use the pre-Islamic architecture for tracing, for learning, as an example, as a precedent. But after the revolution, the thinking is they try to find a kind of identity, or make an identity based on the Islamic architecture. But the problem is about definition of Islamic architecture. What is the Islamic architecture? So they try to make a interpretation, or try to redefine the traditional architecture in Iran to Islamic. For example, they try to read the traditional architecture as a religious architecture. For example, we have a central courtyard, actually. The central courtyard is a main element in the Middle East. You can find the central courtyard in Egypt, in Iraq, in Saudi Arabia, and Iran. But after the revolution, they read and actually this central courtyard is based on the connection between the nature and the housing, or nature and architecture, as a kind of, some response to the nature and the ecology. But Islamic government read this element as a religious element. So it is for privacy, for example, for unseeing the woman in a house, or dividing the public or private, or a private space. And this kind of reading also apply in different elements. You can find this kind of reading, for example, in a tomb, or for example, the mosque, or for example, different kind of interpretations. And even the geometry, they said that Islamic architecture has a specific geometry, and we should apply this geometry in architecture. And also in my book, I show how this, at that time, after the Islamic Revolution, all the projects in the studios tried to put the courtyard as an Islamic element in a project, or for example, the specific geometry in facade to be like the Islamic, or kind of make an identity for the project, So thank you so much. I mean, this is a very interesting question. Actually, still we have a problem. What is Islamic architecture? How we can make architecture Islamic, or something based on the Islamic government, Islamic system in pedagogy.
No, thank you so much for answering that question. And you're absolutely right, actually, because I think in the last talk I attended, there was somebody, Sarovar Zaidi, I think, and she mentioned what should actually look like a mosque. But who says that a mosque needs to have a dome and a minaret? I mean, in the old days, that was functional because the minaret was for the azan. But now, do we really need a mosque to look like a mosque? So thank you. Thank you for the thought-provoking comment, Shaikhah and Ali. Thank you.
Welcome.
Yeah. Uzma, have you by any chance had a look at the Glen Merket Mosque in Melbourne?
No, I haven't actually. I should explore it.
It is because I think the discussion around the design of the mosque is probably more interesting, because those questions were asked, and the resulting mosque is very, very different as a result of that.
I'll have a look. Can you note it down? By the way, I'm not an architect. I have no connection to architecture. So I'm like the imposter on these calls, but I just love to learn from all of you.
But you ask a very interesting question about architecture.
Very interesting question on architecture.
Yeah, very fundamental.
Priya, there is a question from Tuba at the moment, and then I have a question as well.
Yes, I couldn't find the hand in motion. Sorry. Thank you very much for both presentation, Ali and Shaikhah. And I have a question for Shaikhah, maybe for both of you. It was a meaningful presentation for me, Shaikhah, because in my PhD study, I'm discussing and studying the process of professionalization of engineering as a discipline in the Ottoman Empire also. And I'm digging more into the dynamics of the process leading towards the civil engineering, because as you know, until the 30s, the definition of engineer and architect had a very ambiguous association in the empire and even in the Republic of Turkey, early republic, Republican period. And so I'm focusing more on the constructional practices and actors for civil engineering in that period. And one of the most difficult issues for me in the process of my study is how can I explain a process in the Ottoman context when there is an army of assumptions that this whole issue of scientific knowledge was established in the European context. And although the Eurocentric perspective is often questioned in academia, I think it is. I think it still contains great pitfalls and traps that were not that we are not even aware of. My question is, do you think the expression of transfer of knowledge as a tricky expression? Because I think there is no doubt that knowledge grows, that encounters and learning from each other, it's okay, but transfer of knowledge is a tricky expression. What do you think?
First of all, thank you very much for this interesting question. May I ask a question? Are you currently a PhD student?
Yes.
Send me, please, your contact. I have a list of resources because
Okay.
Egypt,
Sure.
when I studied Egypt in the 19th century, it was under the Ottoman Empire. Muhammad Ali, the governor, was actually he was sent from the Ottoman Empire. In the Muhandis Khana, at the early stage, many of the teachers were from the Ottoman Empire. So we have a lot in common at that period. When you talk about transfer of knowledge, there is a very interesting book titled Architecture in Translation by Isra Akan.
I know.
So she draws comparison between knowledge transfer and translation. She looks at Turkey and Germany, but she deals a lot with this question of, is it about interpretation, because language is about interpretation, about when we translate some of the meaning, we lose some of the meaning, so do we lose some of the knowledge? So I think this is a very interesting book to start with. So your question is the expression transfer of knowledge? Because I look at the transfer of knowledge with culture, because technology and culture, can we transfer knowledge from a context to another context? And then what about culture? What about the context of people and social? It's a very contested question. We need to unpack it a lot. So, but it's certainly at the core of this discussion about the emergence of knowledge, the evolution, especially when you talk about modernity and the transfer of knowledge and the whole colonization and decolonization of historiography. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Well, those were some great discussion questions and comments. I'm looking at the time and I'm wondering if there are some burning questions or somebody wants to ask something before we close it.
Yes, Priya, I had one question which I deliberately wanted to leave to the end because it's about it's a what next question. And there are two sides to it. One, which is something that Shaikhah brought up anyway, and we probably need to address it as part of anyone doing research on the Indian Ocean Rim, has to do with accessing archives. And I think the comment made was it's very difficult to access archives in Egypt. We've got Anthony Wako on the line here, who's currently in Nairobi trying to access archives in Nairobi. And last week, I believe he had a meeting with the head of the Uganda archives. Goodness, he's actually in the library. The archives in Uganda, where the cost of accessing archives in Uganda will run you up well over $1,000. So it's quite significant. So it basically prices out local researchers. So how the question for us all is how, Ali, you're based in, you did your PhD in Australia, and
Yeah.
Shaikhah, you're based in Egypt. Did you do your research in Egypt, or you did it while you're based in the United States?
Take your first.
Sure, I think, yeah. I'm based in Kuwait. I did
Oh,
the research when I
sorry,
was,
Kuwait, yeah.
and I
Okay.
did the research when I was in the,
Okay, so
but
so
most,
that's so
yeah, even
okay. So
the resources is booked to access in Egypt, so it was
okay.
easier for me to access the US.
Right, and this is it's pertinent because pretty much all countries around the Indian Ocean rim have this problem. Is how do we access archives, and how can we make it more effective or efficient for all researchers in this topic to actually do this? I think Amit said it's probably easy in the context of India, but I know in the context of Uganda, it's very difficult because, again, everything is classified as security risk, even though it isn't, or it's been transferred over. I did my research in the UK, and that's part of the reason. It was easy to access Ugandan archives from the UK. I don't know how, Ali, you found this when you're doing your project in Australia. Maybe you can share your ideas. I know there are lots of researchers online who would be interested in knowing some of this.
Yeah, actually, I think it's a very interesting question, Mark, because I think actually in some term our gathering data was very experimental. The thing is, I traveled to Iran before the COVID, and for 2 times I gathered many things. I got an interview, and I just went to the National Library, University Library. I gathered the student project, books, curriculum. What interesting was that, so I find some books, it's like the first starting kind of or turning point in my gathering data. I find the ISMO, as I mentioned in my presentation, the Italian Oriental institution in Rome. So ISMO published some books and a catalog about the exhibition in Iran. So, and then I just Googled the ISMO and find these archives. And interesting was that I find many of my projects, data and things from this archive, the ISMO, because ISMO was one of the most important institution to transference, exchange, and effect of the architectural pedagogy. And after that, I found like different actors. It's like the kind of the network. I find the most important figures like Italian architects who traveled to Iran and the effect of the pedagogy. So, and then I got an interview with him. Or actually, I found some data in University of Florence and University of Rome. And then I asked them, is it possible to scan some of page? And then kindly they scanned the page and then send me. Or in terms of Howard, the interesting was that, so the Diba was one of the most important, as I said, one of the most important figure in architecture pedagogy, at that time. So it was a question for me when he studied, actually. And I found the Howard. And then I just went to the Howard University Library. Actually, they have a digital library, very interesting digital library. And I searched the name of Diba and actually different things. I found many interesting things that is about Iran. I mean, I did my research not just based on the archive in Iran. It actually was a kind of the network. Some archives in Howard, some archives in ISMO, some archives in the University of Florence. And then after gathering all of this information, I tried to, find a way to make a kind of cohesive narration between all the data. So it's a little bit was hard at that time, because the COVID was shut down many things. I couldn't travel. But it was very interesting for me, actually. So, the book is a result of different archives from architecture or non-architecture archives, actually.
Okay. Thank you. That's good.
I think there are some other comments as well. Does anyone have a question? Saptarishi, you had a response to from your own research experience.
No, I think, Mark, you've partly answered on the lines of what I was going to say. it was ironic that in order to do deep research on colonial India, I had to be based in the Bartlett, and somehow that lent me a greater level of access and credibility, if you call it a neo-colonial persistence of perception, because I've approached this from two vantages. So I work in New Delhi in the School of Planning and Architecture right now, and a lot of material that I had trouble accessing while being based here, I found it suddenly easier the moment there was a label attached to me about where I am researching. So that is one. And second, I want to also add to something that Amit has very usefully said, and this is, I think, our general perspective from the PATIO team as well, that there is definitely, when we start moving beyond the expected actors in our architectural historiography, we might need to look at a lot of material that do not lie in the archive, because I think that's one of the themes that I deal with within PATIO about writing histories, where the question of the archive arises. That so across 19 different sources or something, or archival locations, if I may even call them that, some of them were like family papers and things that were with individuals. It was a lot more enriching to find what these so-called non-institutional settings where material is available yields about architecture. And I think that really expands the field and gives us an example I can immediately think of is the Aurobindo Ashram archives in Pondicherry, which I've used quite a bit in my own research, and which some of the architects or architectural scholars who have researched had completely ignored material because it had nothing to do with architecture in the conventional sense. And it was like, these diaries that a couple of people had written up, and it didn't seem to interest architects or architectural historians. And somehow it was something that I based the novel approach of my own work on, by looking at material beyond that. So I know, and it's a bigger conversation that we would like to have within PATIO in the future. But I just thought I'll share my 2 cents.
Thank you. Thanks, Saptarshi. I do have a lot of interesting comments, and these presentations were fascinating, and thank you all for sharing your expertise and time today. But in the interest of time, I feel like I have to let people go, but feel free to reach out to, I think, the speakers here and the respondents if you have any kind of follow-up collaborations, questions for them. Catherine, I don't know if you wanted to say something before we leave, or Saptarshi, or any of the speakers.
Catherine, I suppose you wanted to say something about the upcoming session, and
Yes.
yeah, I just before that, I'll just thank everyone who's joined us. I mean, I think about half of them have left because we're really close to the 90-minute mark. But yeah, from PATIO, thank you, Priya and Catherine, firstly for organizing this session in such a seamless manner. I want to thank our speakers, Shaikhah and Ali, and of course, Mark, who's made some extremely helpful interventions and comments. And over to you, Catherine, to close. Yeah.
Thanks, Saptarshi. And likewise, I have lots of questions that I would like to ask Shaikhah, Ali, and Mark. It was a fascinating discussion, and particularly this thing about access to archives and how the sort of democratization of information can open up research, and something that we really need to be building towards. But I would actually like to invite you all to attend the next session, which is the first session on landscape ecology and environment next month, the second Thursday of the month, the 13th. We have Labib Hussain and Javera Shahid, who will be speaking about colonial water infrastructures and ecology in Dhaka and Punjab, respectively. So we hope that you'll join us for next month's session, and very much looking forward to seeing you. And over to you, Priya, to close.
I just wanted to end with really thanking Shaikhah, Ali, and Mark for sharing their time and their knowledge with us. And I think it really led to a very enriching and fruitful discussion. So thank you for being here.